The grand arena of Salyaveth was packed with every noble, priest, and citizen who could beg, borrow, or buy their way inside. And millions more watched on screens across the empire as the final trial of the confirmation rites began. But this was not the challenge of sacrifice that tradition demanded. Kalen had corrupted the ancient ceremony into something darker, convincing the high priestess that the human consort needed to prove his worth through combat rather than symbolic offering. And now Deho stood alone on the arena floor facing 6 Athrani warriors, while Valith was held prisoner in the royal box with guards on either side. The rules are simple, Kalen announced from his seat beside his captive sister, and his voice carried across the arena through amplifiers that made it sound like the declaration of a god. The human will face our champions one by one, and if he falls, then his bond with the princess is void, and she will face the consequences of choosing so poorly. The crowd roared with approval, hungry for blood and spectacle, and Deho looked up at Valith with fear coiling in his stomach. She was pale but composed, her silver eyes meeting his across the distance with an expression that said everything she could not speak aloud. "Trust me," those eyes said, "and do not give up." The first warrior attacked without warning, a blur of violet skin and gleaming steel, and Deho barely managed to dodge the blow that would have taken his head. He had no weapons, no armor, nothing but his human body and the instincts that had kept his species alive through ice ages and predators and wars that should have destroyed them, but humans had always been good at improvising. He grabbed a handful of arena sand and threw it into his opponent's eyes, then used a moment of blindness to drive his elbow into the warrior's throat with enough force to send him crashing to the ground. The crowd went silent with shock, and then erupted into confused murmuring as the first champion was carried away. The second and third warriors came at him together, abandoning the pretense of honorable one-on-one combat, and Deho took a blade across his ribs for his trouble, but managed to position them so they got in each other's way. He fought dirty, fought desperate, fought like a cornered animal with nothing to lose. And when the dust settled, 2 more champions lay groaning on the sand, but he was bleeding badly now, his vision starting to blur at the edges, and there were still 3 more opponents waiting. The 4th warrior was more cautious, circling Deho with patient precision and waiting for an opening that would end the fight quickly. Deho feinted left, then threw himself right, and managed to lock his arm around the warrior's neck in a chokehold that his academy self-defense instructor would have been proud of. He held on with everything he had while the Athrani thrashed and struggled. And when the warrior finally went limp, Deho released him and staggered back on legs that felt like they were made of water. 2 more, he told himself, and then either I win or I die trying. The 5th champion moved like lightning, faster than any opponent Deho had faced, and in seconds he was on his back with a blade pressed against his throat. "Yield," the warrior commanded, "and maybe the prince will show mercy." Deho looked up at the royal box, at Valith struggling against her guards, and Kalen smiling with cold satisfaction, and something in him snapped. He headbutted his opponent with enough force to break the warrior's nose, then rolled free and used the moment of confusion to disarm him. When the 5th champion fell, Deho was barely standing, swaying on his feet with blood dripping from a dozen wounds and his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then Kalen himself descended to the arena floor. The prince wore ceremonial armor that gleamed like gold and carried a blade that had been in his family for generations. And he approached Deho with the confident stride of a predator who knew his prey was already beaten. "You have surprised me, human," Kalen admitted as he circled his wounded opponent. "I did not think you would last this long. But it ends here, and when you fall, my sister will learn the price of defying her betters." Deho raised his fists, knowing it was hopeless, knowing he had nothing left to give, and then Valith's voice rang across the arena. I invoke the consort's claim," she shouted, and the words sent a shockwave of disbelief through the crowd. "If my bomb partner falls, I claim the right to fight in his place." Kalen spun toward the royal box with fury twisting his handsome features. "That law has not been invoked in 1,000 years." He snarled. "No Athrani consort would shame their partner, so I am not shaming him," Valeth replied. And she tore free from her guards with a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. "I am fighting beside him, because that is what partners do." She vaulted over the railing and landed on the arena floor with cat-like grace. Then walked to Daho's side and took the sword from his trembling hand. "You have given everything for me," she said softly, and her silver eyes were bright with emotion. "Now let me give something back." They faced Kalen together, princess and human, united against the brother who had tried so hard to destroy them both. The fight that followed would be remembered in Athrani songs for generations. Kalen was skilled and powerful, trained since childhood in the warrior arts of his people. But he had never faced opponents who moved as one, who anticipated each other's movements and covered each other's weaknesses as if they shared a single mind. Valeth's blade danced and Daho's fist struck true. And slowly, impossibly, they drove the prince backward across the blood-stained sand when Kalen finally fell to his knees with Valeth's sword at his throat. The arena was utterly silent. "Kill me," the prince hissed. "It is what I would do. And it is what any Athrani would do." Valeth looked at him for a long moment. And then she did something that shocked every observer in that massive stadium. She lowered her blade and stepped back. "No," she said. "I am going to do something far worse than kill you, brother. And I am going to let you live with your failure." She turned to the crowd, to the cameras broadcasting across the empire, to the millions who had watched a human and a princess stand together against impossible odds. "This is what I learned from my bond partner," she announced, and her voice rang clear and strong, that sometimes the greatest strength is choosing compassion over vengeance, that sometimes the best victory is refusing to become what you are fighting against. And these are human ideas that the Athrani had forgotten, but we can learn them again. In the weeks that followed, the Empire-transformed Emperor Valeth died peacefully in his sleep, with Valeth and Daho at his bedside. And his last words were a blessing for the daughter who had finally shown him what leadership could be. Valeth took the throne as empress with Daho as her imperial consort, and together they began the slow work of reforming an empire that had been built on tradition and hierarchy for too long. Human diplomats flooded Athrani space, bringing their strange ideas about equality and adaptation. And the galaxy watched with fascination as two civilizations began to learn from each other. But on quiet evenings, in the private chambers of the imperial palace, Daho and Valeth were not empress and consort. They were simply two people who had found something unexpected in each other. A partnership forged in fire and blood and desperate choices that had somehow become something real. "Do you ever regret it?" Valeth asked one night as they watched the twin moons rise over Soluvith. Being dragged into all of this, Daho thought about the question. Really thought about it, and the answer came easily. "Not for a second," he said. And he pulled her close with the arm that still bore scars from the arena. Because somewhere along the way, the pretending stopped. Valeth smiled, the genuine smile she only showed when they were alone. And she pressed her forehead against his in the Athrani gesture of deepest intimacy. "And we really are married," she whispered. "I think we always were," Daho replied. "We just needed time to realize it." Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their endless dance. And somewhere among them, humanity continued its strange journey through the cosmos, leaving its mark on every civilization it touched. Not through conquest or domination, but through something far more powerful, the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on the people who mattered. Emperor Valeth Sorn was dying, and everyone in the palace knew it. Even Though no one dared speak the words aloud, Dieho stood before the ancient ruler in a chamber filled with soft light, and the smell of medicines that could not cure what age had broken. And he tried not to stare at the frail figure propped up on cushions of violet silk. The emperor had been a giant once, according to the portraits that lined the palace halls. A warrior king who had united the Athrani clans and forged an empire that spanned 100 star systems. But now he was withered and pale, his golden eyes clouded with time and his hands trembling as they rested on his lap. "Come closer, human," Valeth commanded, and even weakened his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "My eyes are not what they once were, and I wish to see the creature who has caused such chaos in my court." Dieho approached and knelt as Valeth had taught him, with his head bowed and his hands palm up in a gesture of submission and trust. The emperor studied him for a long moment, and Dieho felt those ancient eyes examining him like a specimen under a microscope. "You survived the challenge of worth," Valeth said finally. "My advisors tell me you did not win, but that is not what the arena remembers. And they remember a human who refused to break. I was fortunate." "Your Majesty," Dieho replied carefully. "You were stubborn," the emperor corrected, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered face. "I have known many stubborn beings in my long life, and stubbornness alone does not explain what I saw in those recordings." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a whisper that Dieho had to strain to hear. "I did not summon you here to discuss trials or politics, human, and I summoned you because I need something that no one in this palace will give me." "What is that?" "Your Majesty," Dieho asked. "The truth," Valeth said simply. "I am surrounded by liars and schemers who tell me only what they think I want to hear, and I have forgotten what honesty sounds like. But humans are known throughout the galaxy for speaking plainly, even when wisdom would counsel silence." He fixed Dieho with a stare that seemed to pierce through all pretense. "Tell me about my children," he commanded. "Tell me what you see when you look at them. And do not worry about offending me, because I am dying, and dead men have no use for comfortable lies." Dieho's mouth went dry, and he understood suddenly that this was perhaps the most dangerous moment he had faced, since arriving on Athro on wrong word could destroy everything. But the emperor was asking for truth, and Dieho had never been very good at deception. "Your eldest son, Kalen, is brilliant and capable," he said slowly, choosing each word with care. "He has spent his entire life preparing to rule, and he understands power in ways that I probably never will. But there is something cold at his center, something that calculates the value of everything and everyone in terms of usefulness rather than worth." The emperor's expression did not change, but his hands tightened on his robes. "Continue," he said. "Your second son I have not spent much time with," Dieho admitted. "But what I have seen suggests a man who has given up competing with his brother and found comfort in vices that dull the pain of being second best." Valeth closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again there was grief swimming in their golden depths. "And my daughter?" he asked quietly. "What do you see when you look at Valeth?" This was the hardest question, because Dieho's feelings about Valeth had become complicated in ways he was still trying to understand. "She is brilliant," he said honestly. "Perhaps more brilliant than Kalen, though she hides it behind protocol and propriety. And she has spent her whole life learning to be invisible, because visibility in this court seems to be dangerous." He paused, gathering his courage. "She is also afraid," he continued, "not of death or pain, but of becoming like her brothers, of letting power corrupt her the way it seems to corrupt everyone who reaches for the throne. And I think that fear is what makes her better than them, because she still cares about the cost of the choices she makes." The emperor was very still, and for a long moment, the only sound in the chamber was his labored breathing. "No one has spoken to me like this in 50 years, Valeth whispered, and Dieho was shocked to see tears sliding down the ancient ruler's cheeks. I had forgotten what it felt like to hear truth instead of flattery. He reached out with a trembling hand and gripped Deha's shoulder. I understand now why she chose you. Human. And it was not just for protection, but because you see things that others are too afraid to name. 2 days later, Deha and Valith were taken to the sacred grove for the challenge of bond. The grove was a vast wilderness at the heart of the largest continent, a place where the forest grew thick and ancient, and predators hunted beneath canopies of silver leaves. And they were left there with nothing but the clothes on their backs and told to survive for 3 days. On the first night, something with too many legs and teeth, like daggers, attacked their camp. Deha's instincts took over. The death world heritage that Athrani whispered about with fear and fascination. And he led them through the darkness with senses sharpened by millions of years of human evolution on a planet that wanted to kill everything that lived on Earth, could read the terrain like a book, could sense danger before it arrived, could find shelter and water and safe paths through the chaos. While Valith watched him with growing wonder. They call humans Deathworlders. As an insult, she said on the second night as they huddled together for warmth in a cave Deha had found. But I am beginning to think it is a compliment. Earth was not kind to us, Deha admitted. We had to become survivors just to reach the stars. And I think maybe that is why we refused to stay down when we should. On the 3rd day, assassins found them. They came in the darkness before dawn. 3 Athrani warriors with poison on their blades and murder in their eyes. And Deha fought them with a savagery he had not known. He possessed, he killed 2 of them, but the 3rd drove a poisoned blade into his side before Valith could stop her. Collapsed with fire spreading through his veins. And he knew with terrible certainty that he was going to die in this alien forest, far from everything he had ever known. But Valith refused to let him go. She used knowledge that she was forbidden to possess, ancient healing arts reserved only for the highest priests. And she worked through the night with tears streaming down her face and her hands, glowing with power she should not have wielded when dawn came. Deha was weak but alive, and Valith was unconscious from the effort of saving him. He carried her out of the grove on legs that trembled with exhaustion. And when they emerged into the light of civilization, the crowd that had gathered to witness their return fell silent at the sight of them. They looked like survivors of a war, bloody and broken and clinging to each other with desperate strength. And for the first time, the Athrani court understood that this marriage might be more than political convenience. Emperor received news of their survival with something that looked almost like relief. And he made his decision at last at a formal dinner that evening, attended by all the noble houses and broadcast across the empire. Valith rose from his seat on shaking legs and spoke words that sent shockwaves through Athrani society. I have watched my children compete for my throne for too long, he announced, and I have finally seen clearly which of them deserves to rule. And it is the one who never wanted power at all. He turned to Valith with pride shining in his dying eyes. When I am gone, he said, you will be empress. The room erupted into chaos. And across the table, Kellen's mask of courtesy finally cracked to reveal the cold fury beneath. The Athrani homeworld of Athra hung in the void like a jewel carved from amethyst and pearl. Its surface swirled with violet oceans and continents of white stone that gleamed under the light of twin suns. Deha watched through the transport's window as they descended toward the capital city of Soliveth. And despite everything that had happened, he could not help but feel a sense of wonder at the alien beauty spread out below him. The city rose from the ground like a forest of crystal towers, each building catching the sunlight and scattering it into rainbows that painted the streets in colors humans had no names for. And at the center of it all stood the imperial palace, a structure so massive it seemed to hold up the sky itself. This was to be his home now, at least until the trials were completed, and he was either accepted as a royal consort or cast out in disgrace. the first trial came sooner than Deho expected. Only 2 days after their arrival, he was summoned to the Arena of Worth, a vast coliseum carved from black stone that seated 50,000 Athrani spectators, hungry for blood and spectacle. The challenge of Worth was a test of combat ability, and Deho faced an Athrani champion named Vorith, who stood nearly 7 feet tall with muscles like corded steel and eyes that held nothing but contempt for the small human who dared to face him. Deho had trained with Yunji during the journey, learning what he could of Athrani fighting styles. But he knew before the first blow landed that he was hopelessly outmatched. Vorth was stronger, faster, and had spent his entire life perfecting the art of violence, while Deho was a diplomat who had taken exactly 3 self-defense courses during his academy. The fight lasted less than a minute before Deho hit the ground for the first time, his ribs screaming in protest and blood filling his mouth from a split lip. The crowd roared with laughter and derision, and Deho heard voices calling for Vorith to end it quickly and spare them the embarrassment of watching a human pretend to be worthy of their princess. But Deho got up. He did not know why, could not explain the fire that burned in his chest and drove him back to his feet, when every logical part of his brain screamed at him to stay down. But he rose and raised his fists and faced his opponent again. Vorith knocked him down a second time, harder than before, and Deho felt something crack in his shoulder as he rolled across the arena floor. He got up. The third blow sent him flying into the arena wall with enough force to dent the stone, and his vision went black for a moment before the pain dragged him back to consciousness. He got up. The crowd had gone quiet now, their laughter dying into confused silence as they watched this broken human refuse to accept defeat. Vorith hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time since the fight began, and he looked up at the royal box where Valith sat watching with her hands clenched in her lap and tears streaming silently down her violet cheeks. "Stay down, human," Vorith said, and there was something almost like respect in his voice. "You have proven your courage, but you cannot win this fight." Deho spat blood onto the arena floor and straightened his broken body into something resembling a fighting stance. "Maybe not," he said through gritted teeth, "but I can make you kill me. And I do not think you want that on your honor." The arena was utterly silent now. 50,000 beings holding their breath as champion and challenger stared at each other across the blood-stained sand. Finally, Vorith drove his sword into the ground and knelt. "I yield," he announced, and his voice rang across the stadium. "Not because I cannot defeat this human, but because there is no honor in destroying something that refuses to break. And the Athrani word for such a spirit is unbreaking, and I have never seen it in an alien before today." The crowd erupted into chaos, some shouting in outrage and others in reluctant admiration. But Deho heard none of it because his legs finally gave out and darkness claimed him once more. He woke in a private chamber with Valith sitting beside his bed, her formal robes replaced with simple clothing and her silver eyes red from crying. "You fool," she whispered when she saw him stir. "You absolute idiotic fool. You could have died." "I did not die," Deho pointed out. And he tried to smile, but his split lip made it difficult. Valith made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. And then she did something that shocked him more than anything else that had happened since this madness began. She took his hand. "When I chose you," she said softly, "I did it because I needed protection, because you were a convenient tool who happened to save my life. And I did not care what it would cost you or how it would ruin your future." "I know," Deho said, "but watching you in that arena," she continued, and her grip on his hand tightened, "watching you get up again and again when anyone else would have stayed down, I realized that I'd made a terrible mistake." "You regret the marriage?" Deho asked. And he was surprised to find that the thought hurt more than he expected. "No," Valith said fiercely. "I regret treating you like a tool instead of a person. and I regret not being honest with you from the beginning about what you were walking into." She paused and took a deep breath. "I am the youngest of 4 children," she said, "and my father is dying, and my brothers have spent their entire lives preparing to tear each other apart for the throne. And I never wanted any part of it, but they cannot allow me to remain neutral, because even a princess who wants nothing can become a threat if she lives long enough." "So your brother ordered the assassination?" Deho said. "One of them," Valith confirmed. "I believe it was Kalen, but I cannot prove it. And even if I could, our father would never believe that his golden heir could do something so terrible." She met his eyes with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I do not know if we can survive this," she admitted. "But I want you to know that whatever happens, I am glad it was you who saved me that day. And I am sorry I dragged you into my mess." Deho was quiet for a moment, processing everything she had said. And then he did something that probably violated 17 different Athrani protocols. He squeezed her hand back. "I am still going to do the other trials," he said. "And I am probably going to lose most of them because I am just a human diplomat who got in over his head. But I am not going to quit, and I am not going to leave you alone in this." "Why?" Valith asked. And it was the same question she had asked in the medical bay. The same single word that seemed to carry the weight of galaxies. Deho thought about it, really thought about it. And the answer surprised him, because somewhere between the assassination and the arena, "I started caring about what happens to you," he said honestly. "And I am not very good at giving up on people I care about." Valith stared at him with an expression he could not read, and then slowly, carefully, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his in a gesture that he somehow understood was more intimate than a kiss in Athrani culture. "Then we face this together," she whispered. Whatever comes outside the window, the twin suns of Athra began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. And for the first time since this mad journey began, Deho felt something that might have been hope. The Athrani royal transport vessel Eternal Grace cut through the darkness of space like a blade made of starlight. And Deho stood at a viewing window, watching the stars streak past while he tried to make sense of his new reality. 3 days had passed since he woke up married to a princess. And in that time, he had learned several important things about his situation. First, the Athrani considered the right of bonded debt to be absolutely sacred, a tradition stretching back thousands of years to a time when their species had been warrior clans constantly fighting for survival, and breaking such a bond was considered worse than murder. Second, Deho would need to travel to the Athrani homeworld to complete the confirmation rites, a series of 5 trials that would prove his worthiness as a royal consort. And if he failed these trials, the marriage would dissolve and Valith would face public disgrace that could destroy her political future. Third, almost everyone expected him to fail. "You are thinking too loudly," a voice said from behind him. And Deho turned to find Lieutenant Cho Yunji leaning against the doorframe with her arms. Krasadunji was his assigned honor guard, a title that the Athrani had graciously allowed Earth to provide. Though Deho suspected her real job was to protect human interests rather than his personal safeties, she was small but fierce, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a way of moving that suggested she could probably kill someone with a dinner fork if the situation required it. "I am trying to memorize the 17 forms of Athrani formal address before we arrive," Deho admitted, and he gestured at the datapad in his hand. "Did you know there is a different way to greet someone depending on their rank, the time of day, the phase of their moons, and whether you have eaten in the last 4 hours?" "I did not," Yunji replied, and she walked over to stand beside him at the window. "But I did know that Prince Kalen, Sorn has requested a private audience with you after dinner tonight." Deho felt his stomach tighten at the name. Kalen was Valith's eldest brother, heir to the Athrani throne, And according to everything Deho had learned in the past 3 days, he was brilliant, ruthless, and almost certainly the one who had ordered his sister's assassination. Did he say what he wants to discuss? Deho asked. He did not, Unji said, and her hand rested casually on the weapon at her hip. But I will be stationed outside the door during your conversation, and if you need me, you should knock twice on the wall. Deho nodded his thanks and returned his attention to the datapad. But the words blurred together as his mind wandered to darker thoughts. He had not seen much of Vaelith since their conversation in the medical bay. And when they did cross paths, she maintained the cold formality expected of a Thrani royalty, treating him like a stranger rather than a man she had bound herself to for political protection. Part of him understood that she was playing a role, maintaining appearances in front of her family and servants. But another part felt oddly hurt by her distance, which was ridiculous. He reminded himself, because this was a political arrangement born of desperation, and he had no business developing feelings for an alien princess who had essentially kidnapped him into marriage. The dinner that evening was a formal affair held in the ship's grand dining hall, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns on walls of polished white stone, and servants moving silently between guests carrying platters of food that Deho could not identify. He sat at the high table beside Vaelith, close enough to touch but separated by an invisible wall of protocol and pretense. And he tried his best to use the correct utensils and remember which foods he was supposed to eat with his hands and which would cause offense if he did not use the proper ceremonial knife. Prince Kalen sat across from them, and throughout the meal, Deho felt the weight of the prince's golden eyes watching his every move. Kalen was handsome in the way that predators were handsome, all sharp angles and cold beauty, and when he smiled it never reached his eyes. Beside Kalen sat High Priestess Morith, an ancient Athrani woman whose skin had faded to pale lavender with age and whose silver eyes held the weight of centuries of tradition. And she watched Deho with an expression of barely concealed contempt. "Tell me, human," she said during a pause in conversation, and her voice carried across the table like a challenge. "Do you even understand what the confirmation rites will require of you? I understand that I will face 5 trials designed to test my worthiness." Deho replied carefully, using the formal address for a religious figure that he had memorized earlier. And I understand that the Athrani people have honored these traditions for thousands of years." "Pretty words," Morith said with a dismissive wave of her thin hand. "But words will not help you when the trials begin, Deathworlder. And your primitive human instincts will only carry you so far." Deho felt Vaelith stiffen beside him. But before either of them could respond, Kalen raised his hand in a gesture that silenced the priestess. Now, the prince said smoothly, "let us not judge our guest too harshly before he has had a chance to prove himself. And after all, humans have surprised us before with their stubborn refusal to accept their limitations." Something in his tone made the words sound less like a compliment and more like a threat. After dinner, a servant led Deho through winding corridors to a private study where Kalen waited with 2 glasses of something that glowed faintly purple. "Please sit," the prince said, gesturing to a chair across from his own. "I thought we should speak privately before we reach Athra." Deho sat, accepted the offered drink but did not taste it, and waited for whatever game Kalen intended to play. "You seem nervous," Kalen observed with amusement. "I assure you, I mean you no harm, human. At least not tonight. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe," Deho replied. "Given that someone tried to kill your sister 3 days ago." The prince's smile widened, and for a moment something dark flickered behind his golden eyes before vanishing behind his mask of courtesy. "My sister has always been prone to dramatics," Kalen said dismissively. "But let us not dwell on unpleasant topics when there are more important matters to discuss." He leaned forward in his chair, And his voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur. I am going to be emperor someday, human. And when that day comes, I will need allies who understand the value of practical arrangements over sentiment. And I believe you might be such an ally. What exactly are you offering? Deho asked. Help me secure my position as heir, Kalen said. And his eyes glittered with ambition. Convince my sister to withdraw her claims to power and support my ascension. And when I take the throne, I will dissolve this farce of a marriage and send you home to Earth with enough wealth to live like a king for the rest of your life. The offer hung in the air between them like poison wrapped in silk. And if I refuse? Deho asked quietly. Keelan's smile did not waver, but his eyes went cold as the void between stars. Then I suggest you prepare very carefully for the trials ahead, he said softly, because accidents can happen so easily when traditions are involved. And it would be such a shame if a human who wandered into affairs beyond his understanding were to suffer an unfortunate fate. He rose from his chair and straightened his robes with casual elegance. Think about my offer, he said as he walked toward the door. You have until we reach Athra to decide whether you want to be my friend or my obstacle. He paused at the threshold and looked back over his shoulder. Choose wisely, human. Kang Deho had never expected his life to change in the span of 3 heartbeats. The first heartbeat came when he noticed the assassin. He stood at the edge of the Grand Diplomatic Hall aboard Concordance Prime, the massive space station that served as neutral ground for galactic negotiations. And he watched the proceedings with the careful attention of a man who knew his place in the universe was small but still Mataradea was a cultural attach, which meant he spent most of his time explaining human customs to confused aliens and trying not to cause interstellar incidents by accidentally insulting someone's grandmother, or sacred vegetable, or whatever else. Different species considered important tonight. Representatives from 12 spacefaring civilizations had gathered to discuss trade routes and territorial boundaries. And Deho's job was simple. Stand near the human delegation, smile politely, and stay out of the way. He was very good at staying out of the way, but then he saw the movement in the upper gallery. A figure in dark clothing raising something that glinted under the station's artificial lights. And his eyes followed the angle of that weapon down to its target. Princess Valith Sorn of the Athrani Empire stood surrounded by advisors, her violet skin luminous under the chandeliers, her silver eyes scanning the crowd with an expression of practiced boredom. And she had no idea that death was pointing at her from above. The second heartbeat was when Deho moved. He did not think about protocol or consequences, or the fact that he was a minor diplomat with no combat training who had absolutely no business throwing himself across a crowded room toward alien royalty. His legs simply carried him forward, pushing through startled dignitaries, knocking aside a tray of drinks. His entire being focused on one simple truth. Someone was about to die if he did not act. He reached the princess just as the assassin fired. The plasma bolt seared across his shoulder as he tackled Valith to the ground. And the pain was a white-hot scream that ripped through his body. But he kept her beneath him, kept her shielded, kept her alive. The third heartbeat was when everything went silent. Deho lay on the polished floor with his arms wrapped around a princess he had never spoken to, his blood spreading in a crimson pool beneath them, his vision already starting to blur at the edges. And he heard shouting and running footsteps and the sound of weapons fire as station security finally responded to the chaos. Valith's silver eyes stared up at him from inches away, wide with shock and something else he could not name. And her hands gripped his uniform as if she was afraid he would disappear. Why? She whispered. And her voice was like bells wrapped in silk. Deho wanted to answer, wanted to explain that he had not thought about it at all, that his body had simply refused to watch someone die when he could prevent it. But the darkness at the edge of his vision was growing thicker, and his tongue felt too heavy to form words. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the princess pressing her palm against his wound, her violet blood mixing with his red, and her lips moving in words he could not hear when Deho woke. He was not sure how much time had passed. He lay in a medical bay that hummed with unfamiliar technology, surrounded by devices that beeped and glowed in patterns he did not recognize. And his shoulder throbbed with a deep ache that told him his injury had been serious but was now healing. Ambassador Yum Siora sat beside his bed with her hands folded in her lap and an expression on her face that Deho could not quite read. "You are awake," she said, and her voice was carefully neutral in the way that senior diplomats learn to perfect over decades of hiding their emotions. "How long was I out?" Deho asked, and his throat felt like sandpaper. 14 hours, the ambassador replied. And then she paused in a way that made Deho's stomach tighten with worry. "A great deal has happened while you slept." Deho pushed himself up against the pillows, wincing as his shoulder protested the movement, and he looked at his superior with growing concern. "The princess?" he asked. "Is she safe?" "The princess is perfectly safe, thanks to your actions," Yansior said, and she closed her eyes for a moment before continuing. "She is also, according to Athrani law, now your wife." The words did not make sense at first, and Deho was certain he must have misheard through the fog of medication and exhaustion. "I am sorry," he said slowly. "Can you repeat that?" "Princess Valis Sorn invoked the right of bonded debt approximately 3 minutes after you lost consciousness," the ambassador explained, and her voice remained steady even as she delivered news that made Deho's head spin. "It is an ancient Athrani tradition that creates an unbreakable marriage bond between an individual and whoever saves their life at great personal risk. But I did not agree to anything," Deho protested, and he tried to sit up straighter only to have his wounded shoulder remind him that sudden movements were a terrible idea. "Athrani law does not require your agreement," Yum Siora replied, and for the first time a crack appeared in her diplomatic composure. "She declared you her life bound in front of the entire Galactic Assembly, with representatives from 12 civilizations as witnesses. And according to the Athrani Empire, you are now legally married to their third princess." Deho stared at her in silence while his brain struggled to process this information. He was a cultural attached from Bazan who had joined the diplomatic corps because he was good with languages and terrible at staying in one place. And now, apparently, he was married to alien royalty because he had not been able to stop himself from tackling a princess to save her from an assassin. "What does Earth say about this?" he finally asked. "Earth is currently engaged in extremely delicate negotiations with the Athrani Empire about whether this marriage is legally binding under human law," the ambassador said, and she rubbed her temples in a gesture that suggested she had not slept in the 14 hours since Deho lost consciousness. "The Athrani consider the right of bonded debt to be sacred and inviolable, and suggesting that we might not honor it has already caused 2 minor diplomatic incidents." Before Deho could respond, the door to the medical bay slid open with a soft hiss. Princess Valis Sorn walked in like she owned the room, which given her royal status she probably believed she did, and her silver eyes fixed on Deho with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. She was tall for an Athrani, her violet skin marked with intricate silver patterns that Deho now recognized as royal birthmarks, and she moved with the grace of someone who had been trained since childhood to command attention simply by existing. "Leave us," she said to Ambassador Yansiora, and it was not a request. The ambassador looked at Deho with an expression that clearly asked if he would be all right, and when he gave a tiny nod, she rose from her chair and walked out with the stiff posture of someone who was deeply unhappy about the situation but powerless to change it. Valeth waited until the door closed before she pulled the abandoned chair closer to Deho's bed and sat down in a rustle of expensive fabric. "You must have questions," she said, and her voice was different now that they were alone, softer and carrying an edge of exhaustion that her regal bearing had hidden. "Just one," Deho replied, and he met her silver eyes with what he hoped was calm determination, despite the fact that his heart was pounding against his ribs. "Why?" The princess was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Deho saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like fear. "Because I needed you," she finally said, and she leaned closer as if afraid of being overheard even in this private room. "Because someone in my own family ordered that assassination, and you are the only person in this galaxy who I know for certain wants me alive."